I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, or ACFP. This is a community-based entity that was established in March 2020, so it's very new, and this video is part of our first submission to a parliamentary inquiry. At ACFP, we're organising to involve Australians in planning a better future for themselves and for future generations. We're using a new community engagement and planning framework called National Integrated Planning and Reporting. It sounds bureaucratic, but the simple purpose is to work with any Australian who wishes to participate to create Australia's first National Community Futures Plan. That plan is called Australia Together, and you can find out about it at our website on www.austcfp.com.au. Australian Community Futures Planning has no affiliation with any political party inside or outside Australia. It receives no finance from political parties or other sources. All output from ACFP is supported entirely by voluntarily supplied, non-monetary, in-kind contributions of research for use in long-term planning for the nation. Our aim is to become a recognised centre of excellence in independence in long-term strategic planning for Australia. So we look out to the future for the biggest risks we and our children will face as a society and in our environment, our economy and our democracy. We spend quite a bit of time identifying the key issues that need to be addressed if we're to arrive safely in our preferred future by 2050 or sooner. In 2020, we've identified 20 key issues that need to be resolved by 2030. And we've released a videocast series supplying facts and data that show where we are now in relation to these make or break issues. This series is called The State of Australia in 2020. One of the episodes in this series is about the rise of corporate irresponsibility in Australia, and it's particularly timely because it raises the issue of corporate interference in government in Australia by the Murdoch media. This, of course, is highly relevant for the Senate inquiry currently underway in Australia's Parliament on media diversity. As founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, I've completed extensive research into this issue and have documented this in a full major essay called Prospects for Journalism, the Free Information Market and Democracy in Australia under the ACCC's News Media Bargaining Code. This code is on its way through the parliamentary process at the same time as the Senate inquiry, and decisions about the code have the potential to preempt the inquiry. In particular, if the code is passed in anything like its first draft form, it has much more potential to narrow media diversity in Australia than it does to widen it. It has much more potential to increase the market concentration problems that have grown up in our news media in the dominance of Nine and Murdoch in news content production. It also has significant potential to reduce the access Australians currently enjoy to diverse quality journalism and truthful information, courtesy of the rise of the digital age. So, as part of ACFP's submission to the Senate inquiry on media diversity in Australia, we're submitting an extract from Episode 4, Part 3 of the State of Australia in 2020. This introduces Australians and the Senate Committee to an assembled set of facts about the structure of our news media industry in Australia and the potential impact of a news media bargaining code on independence of journalism and the viability of both old and new business models for news businesses. In summary, ACFP is submitting that the News Media Bargaining Code will make everything worse for journalism, the free information market and democracy in Australia, and will do nothing to fix the real problems in the information market, such as problems of surveillance capitalism, data security and misuse, privacy and personal information protection, consumer scams, political interference, production of quality, ethical news content, and reduction of misinformation and fake news. These problems have arisen because governments worldwide have failed to take the initiative to establish sound regulatory frameworks for participation in and operation of the information market. We can only hope the Senate recognises this regulatory gap and grabs an opportunity to lead the world in responsible operation of digital platforms. Viewers can explore ACFP's submission to the Senate inquiry in full at www.austcfp.com.au.
Australia has been suffering in the 21st century with the growth of corporate irresponsibility, particularly in the fossil fuel industry and the financial sector. Running in parallel with that sort of corporate power play and reinforcing it is a partnership between the Conservative federal government since 2014 and the Murdoch media. This partnership has been operating in an anti-competitive way to gradually disable the taxpayer-owned ABC and reduce whatever competition it may pose to Murdoch. It has also operated very effectively to disable the open market design of Australia's national broadband network, with the coalition government abandoning the original NBN design of fibre optic cable to homes in 2014 and replacing it with mixed cables to nodes remote from homes. This meant that households would have to pay extra to connect to the NBN, and also that it would be slower than the original design. And this introduced an extra barrier to entry for competitors to Murdoch, such as Netflix. Because of the conversion of the design into cable to the node, Murdoch was able to protect the dominance of his Foxtel cable network in Australia. Both of these power plays, the budget reductions for the ABC and the budget reductions for the lower service design of the NBN, were strongly anti-competitive moves in Murdoch's favour. They have left Australia with a singularly unsatisfactory NBN, in which it has been hard to keep even a basic phone call from cutting out, and an ABC that is unable to retain programs we have valued for decades. At least 1,000 Australians have needlessly lost their jobs at the ABC because of this. The coalition government came to power in 2013, promising not to make cuts to the ABC, but then proceeded relentlessly down a path of reductions until by 2020 the ABC had lost $783 million from its funding. The government has stated that the ABC's funding has not decreased, but their budget papers clearly demonstrate that funding has indeed declined in real terms, meaning the ABC budget hasn't kept pace with the increasing cost of service delivery. Far from it. Other financially harmful steps have also been taken, including the removal of contracts for the ABC with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the privatisation of the ABC's transmission network in 1999. And then, in 2020, the government attempted to exclude the ABC from benefiting on a level playing field with private sector news businesses from the introduction of a news media bargaining code. But more on this later. The fact is, the ABC is being slowly defunded. How do we know? We can easily observe the programming and job losses. Anything else is simply accounting semantics trotted out for obfuscation purposes by a faithless government. It might be different if Australians wanted to spend less of their money on the ABC, but that is not what taxpayers want. Nowhere do we see evidence cited that Australians want a smaller, less capable ABC. On the contrary, when faced with the option of funding cuts for the ABC, Australians respond in the vast majority that it should have the same or more funding. And if there is a choice to be made about who to trust to deliver accurate news, it certainly isn't the view of Australians that the Murdoch press is to be trusted. Murdoch barely rates above social media on trustworthiness. On any poll, such as the Roy Morgan 2019 poll, which found that only 7% of Australians distrust the ABC, Or the 2020 Queensland University of Technology poll, in which Australians clearly placed the ABC at the top of the trust scale. On any of these and similar polls, the ABC consistently comes out as the most trusted media outlet in Australia by far. We're not talking about a small trust gap here. Results of these surveys are an indictment of coalition decisions to defund the ABC. They're simply an insult to taxpayers. On any reckoning, there are absolutely no grounds to believe that Australians want funding of the ABC to be reduced. There are certainly no grounds to conclude that they want taxpayer funds to go to propping up Murdoch. This, however, did not stop the coalition government handing over $40 million of taxpayers' funds as grants to Murdoch between 2017 and 2020, even as, in the same 3-year period, it was reducing the ABC funding by $432 million. That this sort of thing should be happening in Australia, when concentration of media ownership is also growing, is a serious concern. Australia has a very high concentration of media ownership compared to other Western countries. Basically, there is very little competition, particularly in news media, with Murdoch largely dominating the print news market and controlling around 60 to 70% of the daily newspaper sales. Nine controls another large section of the news market, having been given permission to buy Fairfax in 2018, a reprehensible decision which has significantly reduced media diversity. In Queensland, Murdoch owns all but one of the regional newspapers, although in several areas he has been buying them and then shutting them down. That's another blow for media diversity. The problem of too much media concentration has been recognised by hundreds of thousands of Australians, over 500,000 of whom signed a petition to Parliament in late 2020, launched by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd for a royal commission into Murdoch, who Rudd claimed was a cancer on democracy. The petition was signed by Conservative former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and resulted in the establishment of a Senate inquiry into media diversity, or lack of it, in Australia. Everyone from all sides of politics seems to agree that Australia's level of media concentration is not good for democracy and needs to be reviewed. Unfortunately, in 2020, this problem of market concentration in our news media has been made potentially worse by the federal government's insistence on the introduction of a compulsory news media bargaining code. How much worse things can get with Australian news media market concentration is yet to be determined. That will depend on the final form of this code. But the first draft of the code provided an alarming insight into how far the Morrison government is prepared to go in introduction of anti-competitive, utterly unfair market interventions just to please Murdoch. The first draft of the News Media Bargaining Code was a highly exclusive, anti-competitive move by Australia's government entirely in Murdoch's favour. At the direction of the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, it was introduced by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, clumsily disguised as an admittedly unusual but justifiable interference in free market trading negotiations, ostensibly in order to save a public benefit that is at least theoretically provided in Australia by independent news media, that benefit being apparently a well-functioning democracy. It's probable that no one would dispute that open democracies rely heavily on independent news media. But the code, as first drafted, was not designed to save the only news organisations we have in Australia that might be considered independent, inasmuch as they can't be bought by advertisers. It wasn't designed to save the ABC or some other outlets that run largely or wholly independent of advertising, such as The Conversation. Instead, the primary intention of the code was to save essentially non-independent, for-profit news businesses in the private sector, those in thrall to and dependent on advertisers. The government didn't ask itself whether continued and boosted dependence on advertising was a good thing for maintenance of independent public interest journalism. It just decided to enforce a code that would reattach journalism to advertising dependency. It designed a code that would reduce independence in journalism. A new draft of the code was issued by the government on 9 December 2020. This version relaxed some of the mandatory provisions of the original exposure draft and made the code less one-sided, at least, to the extent that it made it somewhat less in Murdoch's favour. But it still tethered journalism to advertising, so it did little, if anything, to establish a sustainable business model for independent, quality journalism. The idea that the code, either version of it, will save independent, quality journalism is tenuous at best and fully false at worst. The code has been promoted as a means of saving public interest journalism from the intrusion of social media and search engine giants Facebook and Google, as though they're the culprits causing the loss of independence and increased market concentration in news media in Australia. Of course, Google and Facebook have nothing to do with that particular problem. They have their own big problems and create market abuses by what we've come to call surveillance capitalism, making money by use of intrusive data collection and algorithms. But neither version of the code will do anything to solve that. The News Media Bargaining Code has been marketed so that it looks like it's all the protection we might need for an important public good, media diversity. But it is more likely to reduce media diversity in Australia, even with the moderations of its first draft. And it does not increase the number of protections for independence and quality in journalism. The proof of this is that if the Australian government were truly committed to protecting the public benefit provided by independent news media for a well-functioning democracy, the best place to start would be to reverse the funding cuts to the ABC. That would give Australians a boost in quality, independent reporting, and it would reinstate local news coverage that has been extinguished by Murdoch. The new draft of the code might be promoted by some as securing the future of the ABC, but in fact, it guarantees nothing of the sort. The News Media Bargaining Code arises from a review by the ACCC called the Digital Platforms Inquiry. But under the original recommendations of the inquiry, the code was meant to be voluntary. It wasn't until Josh Frydenberg insisted that a compulsory one-sided code be imposed that naked favouritism for Murdoch and Nine emerged and left the ACCC flailing around, looking for a way to justify things it had actually refused to recommend in its original Digital Platforms Inquiry final report. The resultant code in its first draft was an unprecedentedly heavy-handed intervention in an extremely important market. Not just the news market, but the whole information market. This intervention, if proceeded with, would do nothing but assault Murdoch's competitors in information provision. It would consolidate his market dominance. The Code Mark II watered down some of the favouritism to Murdoch by allowing Google and Facebook's costs to be taken into account when bargains are being negotiated for payment by Google and Facebook to the news businesses. This turned an entirely unfair code into something fairer, but still wrested final control of deals from the bargainers and still mandated that the news businesses must come out ahead. It still assumed that Google and Facebook would be forced to pay news businesses more than they can claim from them to cover the costs that Google and Facebook incur in sending custom to the news outlets. It thereby ensures that the news businesses cannot end up worse off, which apparently they might if both parties' real costs are taken into account. And so it makes one commercial business subsidise another. This might be good for media diversity, or it might not. We won't know until we see the outcome of the arbitrations. But chances are it is still going to allow Murdoch to prop up his media empire beyond what is safe for democracy. The story of the evolution of the News Media Bargaining Code in Australia is quite instructive about the extent of Murdoch's influence in our government. In reality, an unelected media baron and a conservative erstwhile politician, Peter Costello, have lobbied successfully to persuade the government that unsustainable and inefficient business models should be supported for the news industry, and that those who are making far more efficient business models for a sustainable free information market possible should be drummed out of business in Australia. The fact is that the first draft of the News Media Bargaining Code aims squarely in that direction, and the Code Mark II leaves open the possibility for that to happen. It is still a mandatory code in which Google and Facebook can be forced to prop up Murdoch and Nine, no matter how irresponsible their journalism may become. Only the timing of the compulsion has been changed. No greater standards for public interest journalism are imposed on any news business in return for the funds being forcibly made over to them from Google and Facebook. As such, the Code Mark II contains the same level of threat to independence and quality in journalism as the first draft of the code. The switch from a voluntary code facilitating fair trading between news businesses and Google and Facebook to a mandatory code facilitating an anti-competitive market structure for news marks a new low point in fair regulation of commercial businesses in Australia and very dangerous prospects for independent journalism, the free information market, and democracy itself. For more information on the serious threats posed by the News Media Bargaining Code to journalism, the free information market, and democracy in Australia, viewers may browse the ACFP website for my in-depth essay on this topic. Some of the threats inherent in the original code have been shaved off by the Code Mark II. Google and YouTube are less likely to be driven out of business in Australia, for instance. But the fact that the threat was so clearly levelled at Google and YouTube in the first place shows just how much sway Murdoch has enjoyed and what risk can still arise in the news and free information market if fair regulatory frameworks are not developed. It is instructive that when the first draft of the code was considered by a parliamentary committee, Liberal Party MPs questioned the rationale put forward for the code by Treasurer Frydenberg. They questioned his assertion that there is a power imbalance between Google and Facebook and the news media businesses. They intimated that they found this suggestion laughable, but that it had become clear that the legislation was happening in spite of that and happening simply because that's what the PM wants. Clearly, the PM is in thrall to Murdoch. The Code Mark II may have shaved off a bit of the amounts Google and Facebook may have to pay to the news businesses, but it doesn't rule out unfairness in negotiation. For that reason, it's important to understand the extent to which the anti-competitive features of the original version of the code may still come into play if legislators are not careful. In effect, the government and the ACCC were successfully influenced in mid-2020 to draft a code that would facilitate what is actually a new form of cross-media takeover. It would have created a basis for even more market concentration in news media, and the Code Mark II might still do the same. The first version of the code forced Google and Facebook to pay arbitrarily determined amounts to news media companies, but refused Google and Facebook the reciprocal right to charge for services they provide to the news companies, services which funnel millions of potential customers to them. In the first draft, only one side in this business deal could charge the other for services provided. That has been amended in the Code Mark II, but only to the extent that Google and Facebook must always come out behind, and massive business crippling fines still apply to Google and Facebook for any breaches of the code. They don't apply to news businesses or to Google and Facebook for peddling misinformation, which is, of course, the far more significant problem for democracy. everyone needs to clean up their acts in terms of spreading misinformation. But both versions of the code failed to deal with that. The first draft of the code was also so punitive and one-sided financially that it had the real potential to drive Google in particular out of business in Australia. This means it wasn't a properly proportional market intervention designed merely to correct some sort of imbalance in bargaining power. It was a deliberately disproportional intervention that had the architecture of a facilitated raid on Google in particular. And it was well designed to create a new market imbalance, an imbalance where Murdoch wouldn't just dominate, as he does now, the non-digital offline platforms of print, TV and radio. He would be able to dominate the last frontier of the information market as well, the online digital platforms. If Murdoch's lawyers didn't write the first draft of the News Media Bargaining Code, they may as well have. They will not be pleased that the Code Mark II waters down the financial impact on Google, and neither will some journalists. Throughout the public discussion on the Code, there have been some in the journalism business who have foreshadowed that they will welcome the departure of Google and Facebook, and many who believe that the ACCC's Code, both versions of it, will throw journalists a lifeline. This is a lifeline many journalists think they need because the government has been defunding the ABC, which has resulted in over 1,000 job losses there, and advertisers have deserted commercial print and TV media in favour of the much cheaper online platforms. Many journalists welcome the code, including the watered-down version in Mark II, because it sets up a new market structure in which they, and they alone, can be paid for their content, and for quite a bit more than their news content. They will, for instance, get paid for content about sport, despite the fact that sports journalism can have nothing to do with fostering a well-functioning democracy, and there is no reason why Google and Facebook, or any other online participant, such as the average Australian reader, should be forced to pay for it. Under both drafts of the code, however, journalists can get paid for nearly all their content, regardless of its quality, and regardless of the fact that traditional journalism is just as prone to spreading misinformation as social media. Journalists might spread misinformation less efficiently than social media, but spread it they do on a large scale. Murdoch is full of it, particularly on climate change. This is why trust scores for Murdoch are so low, across all genders and age groups. No wonder he loses money, now that there are alternative sources of news in the digital age. Most Australians simply won't pay for his style of information, and why should they? But under the News Media Bargaining Code, businesses earning above $150,000 a year will be the only ones to get paid for their content, even though, according to the ACCC, we spend less than 3% of our time online browsing their content. Journalists will argue that they should be paid for content as though it is somehow more essential to democracy than all the other information we seek in the other 97% of our time online. Of course, the online information market of the digital age simply doesn't work that way. And if it did, then we wouldn't be enjoying the free access to the vast amount of information that is the real foundation of a modern-day democracy, granted to us courtesy of search engines that impose no fees for search and share. With the digital age information market being set up the way it is, we can all go to the public library for free, and the library itself is now vast and virtually unrestricted, unless content producers themselves put up paywalls and withhold their content. It's important to note that the code does not require news businesses to pull down these paywalls. As such, it means news businesses can rig the system to be paid at least twice, once by Google or Facebook, and once by readers who will still be forced to pay to pull down the paywall. In short, they will have to pay for what has already been fully funded by Google and Facebook. Indeed, it may have even been double funded, because the code allows the news businesses to negotiate with Google to cover all its costs, and then separately with Facebook to cover the same costs again. Google and Facebook will have to raise their advertising fees to cover their losses, which means those Australians who've been able to advertise more cheaply due to the free information market will see a rise in their advertising costs. Nobody really wins here except the big news businesses. We all have to suffer artificially driven up prices for advertising, and more of us will be forced to pay, one way or another, for news we would never otherwise freely choose to buy. The generally open access information system we have now, because of the rise of the digital age, might seem to some to be a threat to income for journalists. In reality, it simply offers journalists a different way to connect with readers. In any case, it's not an unfair deal. Journalists are indeed paid for their content in the form of customers transferred to them by search engines and share platforms for free. Journalists can also conduct searches to prepare their articles for free, so their costs have dropped markedly because of Google, and their efficiency has improved out of sight. But leaving that aside, the fact remains that even if the code does work to give journalists a lifeline, it will only do so for a very short time if it drives the two entities being forced to provide the lifeline out of business in Australia. Version 1 of the code was replete with capacity to do that. The Mark II version has less capacity, but MPs and senators should be careful with amendments so that they don't increase once again the chances that Google can be driven out of business in Australia. If Google is driven out, Australians will have paid a very heavy price for the failure of the code. Neither version of the code can result in an improved diversity in our news media. On the contrary, Google's departure in particular would be good for no one except Murdoch. Indeed, it would not only open up the prospects for him to dominate both the non-digital and digital platforms, it could, if Google is driven out of Australia by the code, also open up the prospect for Murdoch to acquire a search engine. Imagine that. Murdoch owning not just most of the news we read, but the means of how we search for news online as well. Let's take a guess as to how search results would pan out for Murdoch if he slipped into the search engine market. What a ghastly piece of vertical integration and monopolisation that would be. Murdoch will have thought through to that step, and the code, designed as it is the perfect facilitator of such a market takeover. And that the ACCC doesn't seem to see it coming, or has let itself be badgered into it by the Morrison government at Murdoch's nudging, is scary. MPs and senators need to think through to the possibility that Murdoch may monopolise both news and digital search, and they should guard against it assiduously. No draft of the code produced thus far guards against that. The ACCC should be protecting us from such a prospect, but with this code, they're verging towards enabling the biggest cross-media takeover of all. The ACCC's News Media Bargaining Code embeds corporate irresponsibility deeply into our whole democracy because it has the potential to go badly wrong. It can easily create the preconditions for a monopoly in the free information market. That's the most dangerous place for any democracy to have a monopoly. The fact is, over the last 2 decades, search engines like Google have managed to challenge the market concentration of news providers in Australia and have increased news media diversity. Lots of little competitors to these big, overweening, inefficient news producers are opening up in the online market and on YouTube, and they're supported with viable business prospects because of quality search engines. They're regrouping under new business models in which they can be less dependent on and less corrupted by the need to chase income from advertisers. Platforms like Inkle now provide opportunities to multiple outlets and individual journalists to market and get paid for their content without having to sell their soul to excessively powerful news media organisations. We're witnessing an exciting time for journalism and the growth of a truly free press, not the end of the free press. It's the beginning of a new era of news media independence, courtesy of the digital age. Sure, there are teething problems because governments haven't bothered yet to set up a decent regulatory framework for news media in the digital age. We could do that, but instead, the News Media Bargaining Code is threatening to cut off our nascent independent news industry in its infancy. The ACCC's Digital Platforms Inquiry, lowered over as it has been by Murdoch and Nine, suggests that digital platforms are threatening journalism and therefore democracy. But the reality is that digital platforms are not strangling journalism. They're doing the opposite. Diverse journalism is supported, not destroyed, by digital platforms. And the plain fact is that Murdoch and Nine simply don't like this competition and have succeeded in stripping the ACCC's inquiry of most or all of its independence and the value for media diversity in Australia. It's tempting to disparage Google and Facebook for irresponsibility in information market participation, and no doubt criticism is deserved in some respects, particularly in Facebook's case. But news media market concentration isn't one of the faults of Google or Facebook. It's the fault of governments who have over the past 20 years loosened cross-media ownership laws when they shouldn't have. And now, if the ACCC's code goes through in anything like its first draft form, it will increase the market concentration enjoyed by Murdoch and Nine in news yet again. This is not the way for a decent regulator or government to handle the information market's transition from the non-digital to the digital age. And it is not the way to establish fair competition. More to the point, it is not the way to protect Australia's democracy. The consumer and taxpayer should come first with the ACCC, but we have been coming last. No wonder Kevin Rudd calls Murdoch a cancer on democracy. Those Liberal Party MPs who told the Sydney Morning Herald that they were perplexed by the code asked themselves a really good question. What problem are we trying to fix here? Australian Community Futures Planning contends that the government and the ACCC, through the News Media Bargaining Code, are attempting to solve the wrong problem. More than that, they're making one problem, Murdoch's excessive power, worse, and yet doing nothing to fix the real problems of the digital age. Google and Facebook may engage in market abuses, but in reality, those abuses are not the ones having the biggest impact on democracy in Australia. Not yet, anyway. In 2020 in Australia, the far greater pernicious influence on our democracy is coming from the irresponsible corporate behaviour of the Murdoch-dominated, non-digital news media oligopoly, aided and abetted as it has been by successive Australian governments in their irresponsible weakening of cross-media ownership laws. That's where a truly harmful regulatory vacuum has emerged, and that is one of the main problems that the Senate Committee on Media Diversity needs to correct. The committee also needs then to focus on creating a regulatory framework to prevent impacts on our democracy arising from the circulation of fake news and misinformation on both the digital platforms and the non-digital platforms of print, TV and radio. Australian Community Futures Planning's submission to the Senate inquiry on media diversity in Australia offers a suggestion for senators about a process by which Australia can establish a much better regulatory framework for ethical operation of the digital age free information market, one that is much better than either version of the ACCC's code. This alternative process involves putting the interests of news and information consumers and democracy before the interests of both the media barons and the digital platforms. We are suggesting commencement of a process of community engagement for transparent, inclusive, collaborative planning for a 21st century democratic information market. Here we are, right at the start of the digital age, and yet we're shunning opportunities to enhance the functioning of democracy in that new age. A process to fix that can be overseen by the Senate. It would avert the disaster for democracy that can easily be brought on by the implementation of the News Media Bargaining Code, a process in which Australia's reputation in fair market regulation and open democracy could end up being seriously damaged. We could replace that with a process which would elevate Australia to the position of a world leader in regulation of an ethical and open information market capable of supporting a truly liberal democracy. For more information on this, visit ACFP's news website at www.austcfp.com.au/news and follow the links to our submission to the Senate inquiry into media diversity in Australia. Thanks for watching this extract from the State of Australia in 2020. You can view ACFP's full submission to the Senate inquiry on media diversity in Australia at www.austcfp.com.au/news. We sincerely hope the Senate committee finds this submission helpful, and if senators and Australians wish to know more about how we can work together to develop a plan to address the issues raised in this and other episodes of the State of Australia in 2020, browse the website and subscribe for updates. If you like this episode, please click like on the YouTube page and share the episode with your friends and subscribe to this channel.